I had the beautiful wife, I had a home, a solid gold reputation and career, cars, money to burn, and every night I wanted to die.
Eric Clapton has been hailed as one of rock's greatest guitarists, a legend whose blues-soaked riffs and unmistakable tone shaped generations. Fans know the albums, the anthems, and the collaborations that turned him into a cornerstone of music history. But what they didn't know was the resentment he carried quietly through the years. Rivalries left unspoken, wounds left unhealed, names never revealed, until now. At 80, Eric Clapton finally breaks his silence. He names the 5 musicians he hated the most, artists who clashed with him, betrayed him, or left scars that no amount of success could erase. It isn't just a confession. It's a confrontation. But who were these musicians, and why did Clapton wait until now to unmask them? Eric Clapton and George Harrison shared a friendship and musical kinship that, to outsiders, seemed unshakable. Clapton famously played lead guitar on Harrison's "While My Guitar Gently Weeps," lending a blistering, emotional edge to one of the Beatles' most revered compositions. Their circles overlapped constantly. Jam sessions, studio collaborations, and a shared reverence for the blues and rock traditions that defined the 1960s. On paper, they were a match made in musical heaven. 2 guitarists whose talents could complement each other seamlessly. But admiration often conceals undercurrents, and collaboration, especially among strong-willed geniuses, can breed subtle yet lasting tension. Over time, Clapton's feelings toward Harrison evolved into something far more complicated, tinged with quiet resentment and lingering frustration. The tension between them was deeply personal, intertwined with one of the most public and romanticized love triangles in rock history. Clapton had fallen hopelessly in love with Pattie Boyd, Harrison's wife, whose beauty, charm, and grace captured his heart with the intensity only a true romantic could feel. Clapton's infatuation led him to write Layla, one of the most celebrated songs in rock history, a musical testament to the torment of unrequited love. Harrison, aware of the depth of Clapton's feelings, maintained composure that many considered stoic, but for Clapton, it created layers of strain. Every interaction carried an unspoken tension. Casual conversation, jam sessions, or social gatherings were tinged with the awareness that his desire could never be openly reciprocated. Friends recalled Clapton making wry, bitter jokes about Harrison's ability to remain unshaken while simultaneously thwarting his romantic hopes. Over the years, the personal dimension of their relationship cast a long shadow over their musical partnership. What might have been pure admiration slowly morphed into frustration, tinged with envy and lingering bitterness. Musically, the two also clashed in philosophy, despite their shared blues foundation. Harrison's approach to the guitar was meditative, infused with spiritual depth and layers of subtlety. Each note was deliberate, every chord carefully chosen to evoke serenity and transcendence. Clapton, by contrast, thrived on raw, blues-driven intensity. He preferred the immediacy of emotion, the unpredictability of improvisation, and the visceral power of a guitar solo that could tear through a listener's chest. While critics and fans celebrated the combination, the contemplative subtlety of Harrison layered with Clapton's searing virtuosity, Clapton privately found some of Harrison's methods controlling, even pretentious. Harrison's insistence on perfection, the slow, deliberate creation of soundscapes, and his deeply spiritual approach sometimes frustrated Clapton, whose blues sensibilities demanded spontaneity and emotional authenticity. Even in their studio sessions, what looked like collaboration to outsiders could be fraught with tension. Clapton wanted freedom, movement, expression, Harrison sought cohesion, precision, and emotional subtlety. The contrast created friction, even when the resulting music was extraordinary. Clapton's recollections in later interviews suggest a grudging respect for Harrison's artistry, mixed with irritation over the constraints that Harrison's meticulous approach sometimes imposed. It was a paradox. The man whose music inspired him could also be the man whose methods provoked frustration. Their friendship endured over decades, but it was never free of scars. By the time Clapton publicly reflected on the relationship in his later years, he admitted a lingering irritation. Harrison, despite their shared history, talent, and mutual admiration, sometimes embodied the very obstacles Clapton despised: subtle competition, understated superiority, and a reserve that masked judgment. Harrison's quiet perfectionism, which may have inspired so many, simultaneously challenged Clapton, highlighting vulnerabilities and insecurities that could not easily be ignored. Harrison may have been celebrated globally, a Beatle whose influence was immeasurable, yet for Clapton, he remained a reminder that even friendships between the most talented can carry tension, envy, and grudges that endure quietly behind the music. This dynamic was compounded by public perception. Fans and media alike painted the relationship as a harmonious brotherhood, emphasizing stories of collaboration and mutual inspiration. They did not see the private moments of exasperation, the jealousy, or the occasional sting of emotional rivalry. For Clapton, who had always lived through the highs and lows of artistic scrutiny, the public narrative obscured the more nuanced reality. Admiration could coexist with resentment, collaboration with frustration, and affection with envy. Even as Clapton's career soared, Harrison's presence remained a touchstone of unresolved tension. In interviews, Clapton occasionally alluded to the complexities of working with peers who were both friends and rivals. He described scenarios in which Harrison's quiet critique, composure, or perfectionism forced him to confront aspects of his own ego, insecurities, and approach to music. Harrison, in turn, likely saw the same intensity reflected back in Clapton, a fiery bluesman whose genius demanded freedom and emotional authenticity. In retrospect, Clapton's enduring irritation was not born of hatred, but of the complicated interplay between personal longing, artistic vision, and the inescapable reality that admiration can sometimes become a source of friction. By the end of his life, Clapton acknowledged Harrison as a masterful musician, a friend, and a figure whose impact on rock and blues could not be overstated. Yet he also confessed that Harrison represented the subtle tensions, emotional games, and understated rivalries that even lifelong friendships in the music world could carry. The blend of respect and resentment, love and frustration, admiration and irritation made Harrison a uniquely complicated figure in Clapton's life, a symbol of everything brilliant yet frustrating about personal and musical collaboration. For Eric Clapton, George Harrison was not merely a friend or collaborator, he was the embodiment of a quiet tension, a figure whose influence shaped music, hearts, and egos alike. And even at 80, when Clapton looked back on a lifetime of music, he admitted the truth. Friendship, even among geniuses, does not preclude grudges. Eric Clapton and Jimmy Page have always shared the distinction of being two of the most iconic guitarists in rock history. To fans, their names are often spoken in the same breath, their legacies compared in endless debates about technique, tone, and influence. Yet behind the public admiration and mutual recognition lay subtle friction, a rivalry rooted in philosophy, ego, and artistic approach. Clapton respected Page's skill, his technical brilliance, and the innovation that Led Zeppelin brought to rock music, but he also harbored a quiet frustration at the theatricality and posturing that sometimes accompanied Page's performances. The tension first emerged in the late 1960s, a time when the British blues scene was exploding into global consciousness. Clapton had already established himself with Cream and the Yardbirds, commanding respect as a guitar virtuoso whose solos spoke of raw emotion and deep blues roots. Then came Led Zeppelin, fronted by Jimmy Page, whose guitar work combined blues foundations with a larger-than-life stage presence. Clapton reportedly admired Page's technical ability, the speed of his fingers, and the creative ingenuity behind songs like Stairway to Heaven. But admiration was tinged with irritation. While Clapton valued authenticity, intimacy, and emotional honesty in music, he sometimes viewed Page's approach as calculated spectacle, grandiose, theatrical, and designed to dazzle audiences rather than communicate directly with them. This friction extended beyond personal taste into philosophy and work ethic. Clapton viewed the guitar as a conduit for raw feeling, an instrument through which personal pain, joy, and experience could flow unfiltered. Improvisation was central to his artistry. Each performance was a moment of truth, a conversation between musician and listener. Page, however, excelled at precision, structured composition, and dramatic presentation. His solos were often meticulously planned, his stage movements theatrical, and his production choices aimed at creating a sonic spectacle. To Clapton, there was brilliance in that, certainly, but also a sense of detachment, a prioritization of style over the emotional immediacy that defined the blues. The rivalry intensified during shared appearances at festivals, awards shows, and industry events. Clapton, who rarely sought attention outside of his craft, reportedly grew weary of the hype surrounding Page. "Some guys just get the crowd screaming for the wrong reasons," he once remarked in private, hinting at his belief that Page's charisma and showmanship sometimes overshadowed substance. Page, in turn, was not unaware of Clapton's position in the musical hierarchy, nor of the subtle criticisms that circulated among British blues circles. Though never openly hostile, the tension simmered in private. Whispers backstage, sidelong glances, and subtle comparisons that left both men aware of the other's presence in a competitive, high-stakes arena. By the 1970s, as Led Zeppelin ascended to become the defining rock band of the era, Clapton faced the dual challenge of sustaining his blues credibility while navigating a landscape dominated by flamboyant acts like Page's. The rivalry, though never publicized, shaped Clapton's approach to his own music. He doubled down on emotional authenticity, improvisational expression, and the slow burn of live performance, contrasting Page's emphasis on spectacle and structured grandeur. Observers note that Clapton's more subdued approach allowed him to cultivate a devoted audience, one that valued depth over showmanship, while Page commanded arenas with visual flair and technical wizardry. Despite the tension, admiration lingered. Clapton repeatedly acknowledged Page's genius, the innovation that Led Zeppelin brought to rock music, and the technical mastery of his guitar work. The frustration was never about ability, it was about approach, philosophy, and what Clapton perceived as a prioritization of image over musical soul. The rivalry was subtle, intellectual, and philosophical rather than overtly personal, yet it left a lasting impression. It was a reminder that even among giants of the same craft, differences in vision can breed quiet resentment. By the 1980s and 90s, the so-called rivalry was cemented in rock lore. Fans debated endlessly, music journalists compared their soloing styles, and both artists were forever linked in the cultural imagination. Clapton admitted in later years that envy had sometimes played a role, though he framed it more as recognition of competition than personal animosity. Page, in Clapton's eyes, became the archetype of a musician capable of simultaneously inspiring awe and irritation, a figure who represented both the heights of rock achievement and the compromises Clapton refused to make in his pursuit of authenticity. Their paths would cross sporadically in studios, benefit concerts, and retrospectives, but collaboration was rare. Clapton preferred the intimacy of his own ensembles, the dialogue of blues-based improvisation, and the freedom to explore emotional landscapes without theatrical constraints. Page thrived in environments where the guitar solo became spectacle, the riff a statement of dominance, and the audience a participant in the drama. To Clapton, the contrast was glaring and, at times, exasperating. Even at 80, reflecting on his career, Clapton acknowledges the tension between admiration and resentment. Page remains a towering figure, an artist whose genius is impossible to ignore. Yet for Clapton, the rivalry serves as a lesson in the subjective nature of musical greatness. Brilliance can be measured in multiple ways. But what resonates most deeply is authenticity. Page's achievements were undeniable. The frustration lay in the divergence of values, the collision of philosophies, and the recognition that even peers can embody both inspiration and irritation. In the end, Jimmy Page represents more than a rival. He embodies the duality of admiration and grudge. To Clapton, the comparison was inevitable, unavoidable, and formative, a reminder that even friendships among legends are colored by philosophical tension, ego, and competing visions of what rock music should be. Eric Clapton's relationship with Phil Collins has always been complicated, not in terms of personal conflict, but in the way Clapton perceived Collins's approach to music. While the two crossed paths at awards ceremonies, charity events, and industry functions, Clapton's disdain for Collins was rooted in philosophy rather than personal betrayal. Where Clapton's career was steeped in the raw, improvisational honesty of blues, Collins's work embodied polished production, catchy hooks, and pop sensibility. This contrast became a source of simmering tension, one that would linger for decades. The divide between the two was first noticeable during the 1980s, when Collins was at the peak of his commercial dominance. Genesis had evolved into a progressive rock powerhouse, and Collins's solo career was flooding radio waves worldwide with songs like In the Air Tonight and Against All Odds. To Clapton, Collins's music was technically proficient, but too pristine, lacking the grit and imperfection that gave blues its soul. Every track that climbed the charts reminded Clapton of what he saw as an industry increasingly obsessed with commercial appeal over authenticity. He admired Collins's skill as a drummer and a songwriter, but he bristled at the artificial sheen, the studio trickery, and the formulaic nature of many pop hits. Clapton reportedly described Collins privately as slick, too perfect, too safe. A musician whose talent was undeniable, but whose approach diverged from the raw truth Clapton cherished. The blues, after all, was born from struggle, from unfiltered emotion and human imperfection. Each note, each bend, each vibrato conveyed lived experience. Collins's perfection, while pleasant and radio-friendly, represented the antithesis of that philosophy. Clapton's quiet resentment grew with every Grammy, every chart-topping single, and every mainstream accolade awarded to someone whose work he perceived as polished to the point of sterility. The tension extended beyond recordings to live appearances. Clapton, who had spent decades honing his craft in small clubs, smoky venues, and intimate stages, valued connection with both bandmates and audience. Improvisation was sacred, every performance an opportunity to converse musically, to explore the emotional landscape of each song. Collins, while a consummate professional, often approached concerts and collaborations with precision, rehearsed cues, and structured arrangements designed for maximum audience impact. Clapton saw this as evidence that Collins prioritized spectacle over substance, and it irked him. The difference was philosophical. Clapton played to feel. Collins played to impress. Their paths occasionally intersected during charity events, studio sessions, and industry gatherings. To outsiders, these meetings seemed cordial, professional, even friendly. Clapton, however, often found Collins's presence emblematic of the industry shift he privately resented. In interviews, Clapton would speak of pop culture trends and the music business's obsession with commercial formulas, never naming Collins outright, but alluding to artists whose polished success overshadowed emotional authenticity. The subtext was clear. Collins was one of the emblematic figures of a world Clapton both admired and despised. Clapton's frustration with Collins was not personal. It wasn't born of malice or rivalry, but it became philosophical and generational. Collins's music represented a divergence from Clapton's musical roots, a move toward accessibility that, while popular, left Clapton uneasy. It was a tension between two kinds of mastery, one grounded in emotion, improvisation, and history, and the other in perfection, mass appeal, and contemporary polish. Clapton's blues ethos and Collins's pop sensibility were at odds, a collision of ideologies that silently irritated Clapton for years. Despite the tension, Clapton acknowledged Collins's talent. He respected Collins's drumming, his songwriting acumen, and his ability to command stadiums and airwaves alike. But admiration did not erase irritation. Clapton's reflections in interviews leading up to his 80th birthday revealed a grudging acknowledgement of Collins's skill alongside a lingering philosophical annoyance. The frustration was subtle, simmering beneath the surface, but persistent enough that Clapton ultimately named Collins among the musicians he disliked the most. In essence, Phil Collins became a symbol for Clapton of everything he found troubling in modern music: the prioritization of perfection over soul, of commercial success over emotional depth, and of accessibility over authenticity. While Clapton's career navigated the delicate balance between mainstream appeal and blues integrity, Collins represented one extreme, a reminder of the very forces Clapton often had to negotiate. The resentment was quiet, intellectual, and enduring, a philosophical grudge as much as a personal one. By the end of the 20th century, Clapton's perspective had crystallized. Collins's brilliance was undeniable, yet his approach continued to highlight the tension between artistry and commercial sensibility. To Clapton, this tension defined not only his private opinions, but also his broader understanding of the music world, a world where admiration and irritation could coexist in the same glance, and where one could respect a musician's achievements while quietly disliking the values they embodied. For Eric Clapton, Phil Collins was more than a pop icon. He was a reminder of the divide between blues authenticity and mainstream polish, a figure whose success highlighted what Clapton loved and what he quietly resented about the evolving music industry. The grudge was subtle, philosophical, and enduring, finally revealed in full when Clapton turned 80, a testament to the complexity of admiration, competition, and the ways music shapes personal sentiment. Eric Clapton's relationship with Van Morrison was complicated from the very first encounter. Both men were celebrated for their talent, revered for their musical intuition, and feared by collaborators for their intensity. Morrison's reputation as a mercurial genius preceded him, a singer-songwriter capable of transcendent brilliance one moment and inexplicable obstinacy the next. For Clapton, Admiration for Morrison's artistry was inseparable from frustration over his temperament, a combination that created one of the most conflicted relationships in modern rock history. Their paths crossed multiple times in studio sessions, live collaborations, and industry circles. Each encounter was an exercise in patience and diplomacy. Clapton, used to working with musicians of all temperaments, found Morrison's unpredictability exhausting. While some artists might respond to gentle persuasion or structured collaboration, Morrison operated on his own terms, following instinct rather than consensus. Clapton, who valued emotional honesty in music but also expected professionalism, often found these clashes exasperating. A session that could have flowed smoothly was frequently derailed by Morrison's sudden withdrawal or abrupt refusals to engage with certain ideas. The tension was amplified by the contrast in their musical philosophies. Clapton's work was rooted in the blues, a genre built on improvisation, feeling, and dialogue with the audience. Every guitar note was an expression of personal experience, a reflection of emotion as much as technical skill. Morrison, meanwhile, approached music as a spiritual journey, a channeling of deeper, often ineffable truths. While the results were magical, a song that could transport listeners into mystical landscapes, the process was often torturous for those who relied on structure, collaboration, or predictability. Clapton admired the brilliance, but he resented the difficulty of reaching it. Beyond professional challenges, Morrison's personality created interpersonal strain. Clapton reportedly found the singer's temperamental streaks and uncompromising demands not only inconvenient, but sometimes insulting. Morrison could swing from warmth to icy detachment without warning, leaving collaborators scrambling to adjust. Musicians close to both men recall Clapton's exasperation at moments when Morrison's genius seemed inseparable from personal obstinacy. It wasn't just about temperament. It was about the subtle ways Morrison's behavior could overshadow the contributions of others, no matter how skilled or dedicated. Despite the frustrations, Clapton recognized Morrison's brilliance. There was no denying the artistry, the way Morrison's voice could convey longing, transcendence, or raw human emotion with a single inflection. Clapton admired the songwriter's ability to craft songs that were at once personal and universal, steeped in Celtic mysticism, yet accessible to listeners across the globe. It was precisely this duality, the simultaneous awe-inspiring talent and the personal exasperation, that defined Clapton's feelings toward him. Over the years, the resentment deepened, not as a sudden burst of anger, but as a slow accumulation of minor irritations and disrupted collaborations. Clapton reportedly found Morrison's dismissive or unpredictable behavior at charity events, recording sessions, and informal jam sessions to be emblematic of the very arrogance that could poison creativity. The genius was undeniable, but the personal cost was high. Clapton came to associate Morrison's brilliance with frustration, irritation, and occasional humiliation. Emotions rarely voiced publicly, but persistent in private reflections. Their musical connection, however, remained undeniable. When the chemistry worked, the results were extraordinary. Clapton could watch Morrison craft a song and feel the pulse of creativity, the spark that separates greatness from mediocrity. And yet, that spark often flickered in unpredictable ways, leaving Clapton to navigate both inspiration and exasperation. Morrison became, in many ways, a test of patience and resilience, a reminder that talent and temperament are not always harmonious. By the time Clapton reflected on his career approaching his 80th birthday, he could separate admiration from resentment, recognizing the genius while acknowledging the personal difficulty of working with Morrison. In interviews, He described the experience with a mix of awe and frustration. A musical kindred spirit who inspired brilliance, yet whose personality created barriers, discomfort, and occasional professional tension. Morrison's mercurial nature was as essential to his art as it was trying for those around him, and Clapton never fully reconciled that paradox. Van Morrison, in Clapton's eyes, became more than a collaborator or a fellow musician. He was the embodiment of the duality of genius, the idea that brilliance often comes with a personal cost, that the light of inspiration can cast equally long shadows of irritation. Clapton's respect for Morrison's talent never wavered, but neither did his acknowledgement of the frustration, fatigue, and subtle resentment that accompanied every encounter. It was a relationship defined by admiration, complicated by personal and professional challenges, a reminder that genius is rarely simple and that musical camaraderie can exist alongside quiet, enduring dislike. For Eric Clapton, Van Morrison was a mercurial genius whose artistry demanded respect, but whose personality demanded patience, resilience, and, ultimately, cautious distance. He inspired, he irritated, and he endured in Clapton's reflections as a figure impossible to ignore, emblematic of both the allure and the cost of brilliance. Eric Clapton's admission that George Michael was one of the musicians he disliked most might come as a surprise to fans. Unlike Jimmy Page or Van Morrison, the tension with Michael was not rooted in shared history or direct competition. Instead, it stemmed from generational divides, contrasting musical philosophies, and a clash of cultural values that defined two very different eras of popular music. Where Clapton's world was the blues, improvisation, and emotional authenticity, George Michael's universe was polished, pop-driven, and image-conscious, a universe Clapton struggled to respect. Their interactions were sporadic but memorable. Charity galas, awards shows, and social circles brought the two men into proximity, and Clapton often felt disoriented by Michael's effortless charm, media savvy, and celebrity presence. While Clapton had spent decades building a reputation through guitar mastery, heartfelt songwriting, and a deeply personal connection to the blues, Michael seemed to navigate fame with ease, turning it into an art form in itself. To Clapton, this created a subtle but persistent irritation. Admiration for talent tempered by skepticism of authenticity. The tension also reflected a generational shift in music. Clapton came of age during the 1960s, a time when rock and blues were intertwined with rebellion, raw emotion, and improvisational risk. Authenticity was measured in sweat, heartbreak, and the unfiltered intensity of a guitar solo. George Michael, by contrast, emerged in the 1980s as a pop icon, a performer whose career was meticulously crafted, from image to production. Hits like Faith and Careless Whisper demonstrated perfection in timing, harmony, and appeal. But they were products of calculated excellence rather than the gritty, unpredictable energy Clapton revered. Clapton reportedly bristled at the contrast. He respected Michael's musical gifts. Few could match his voice, songwriting ability, or stage presence. But he found the performative polish unsettling. "It's too clean," Clapton reportedly told friends, referring not just to the music, but to the persona Michael projected. Every note, every public appearance seemed rehearsed, perfected, and almost untouchably flawless. For a musician who built a career on improvisation and vulnerability, this was not merely a difference in style. It felt like a philosophical affront. The friction was exacerbated by their public personas. Michael exuded charisma, confidence, and an effortless charm that captivated media and audiences alike. Clapton, often quieter, more introspective, and deeply focused on musical substance, found it difficult to reconcile the adoration Michael received with what he perceived as a lack of the rawness and struggle that had defined his own career. It wasn't jealousy in the conventional sense, it was more a sense of dissonance, a feeling that the music world had shifted in a way that elevated style over depth. This generational tension became more pronounced during shared events. Clapton reportedly grew frustrated when Michael dominated conversations, interviews, or media attention with ease, drawing attention away from other musicians whose careers were built on decades of painstaking work. The disparity in their approaches, Clapton's painstaking, emotion-driven craft versus Michael's sleek, audience-focused performance, highlighted the differences not just in music, but in values. Clapton saw artistry as honesty. Michael saw artistry as perfection and influence. Their dislike was never openly hostile, but it simmered beneath the surface. Clapton respected talent, but he also had little patience for ego that overshadowed substance. Michael's presence reminded him of the evolving landscape of music, one in which charisma, image, and mass appeal could rival or even surpass technical mastery and emotional authenticity. In private, Clapton admitted that the frustration was as much about the era Michael represented as about the man himself. It was a clash between old-school blues philosophy and a new era of pop spectacle. Yet, even with the friction, Clapton acknowledged Michael's brilliance. Few could craft melodies, deliver vocals, or connect with audiences as effectively. It was a grudging respect tempered by irritation. Recognition of skill alongside the belief that something essential had been lost in the process. Clapton's dislike was not rooted in personal animosity, but in a philosophical clash, an embodiment of the tension between tradition and transformation, depth and polish, authenticity and celebrity. By the time Clapton reflected publicly on these relationships in his 80th year, George Michael's inclusion was telling. It illustrated that even legends of rock could feel tension with artists outside their immediate circle, artists representing changes in the cultural and musical landscape. Michael became a symbol of a new era, Clapton neither fully understood nor fully embraced, a reminder that the evolution of music could inspire admiration while provoking resentment. For Clapton, George Michael was more than a pop star. He was a mirror reflecting the changing tides of the industry, a symbol of style and era that clashed with the blues-rooted, emotionally raw world Clapton had spent decades cultivating. He represented brilliance and frustration, talent and philosophy, admiration and subtle dislike all at once. And in confessing this to the world at 80, Clapton offered a rare glimpse into the private musings of a musician who had long balanced genius, envy, and the weight of artistic integrity. George Michael, in Clapton's eyes, was a musician to respect, a performer to admire, and yet a figure to view with caution, frustration, and mild exasperation. He was the embodiment of the clash between eras, the tension between perfection and grit, and a reminder that even in a world of mutual reverence, differences in philosophy, style, and temperament can lead to enduring, if unspoken, dislike. If a legend bears his grudges after decades of silence, does it tarnish the music or reveal the cost of creating it? At 80, Eric Clapton's words uncover a side of rock history few ever dared to imagine, and in doing so, he forces us to see the man behind the myth. The names may fade, but the truth lingers, echoing louder than any guitar solo. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.